couple minutes for people to join. So make sure if you have any questions at all, please use the Q&A tab. You're also welcome to use the chat. If for whatever reason you're having some sound issues, please do chat us so we can work through that. This meeting will be recorded and shared with everyone after the session too. So if you have to hop early or you're joining late, you'll be able to see a full copy of this. But we're going to start in just a couple minutes. So just be patient with us and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. We're going to kick it off with just some logistics. We'll see if some other people start to trickle in. So my name is Megan. I lead the North America marketing team here at MoEngage. If you're not familiar with our growth community, it's a really great community full of marketers and product owners from around the world. And as part of our growth series, we like to offer courses, thought leadership, content material, both collected from the community, but also from peers in your network so that you can learn from one another. So we're very, very excited for today's session. This will cover data-driven marketing. If we want to go to the next slide, I wanted to quickly just introduce our guest speaker today. His name is Ruben. He's from Practico Analytics. And so while everyone appreciates the importance of marketing strategy, very few hit the bullseye. And so we're very, very excited to have Ruben here with us today for the growth session. He's going to talk to us about data-driven marketing strategies that will help you navigate next year. And so he'll walk through some of the common challenges that you may all be facing, as well as just some opportunities for planning and development. So with that, I will let Ruben introduce himself and take it away. Thanks, Ruben. Just if you want to unmute yourself.
Perfect. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Well, happy to be here. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm excited to be talking about strategy today, especially within the context of marketing teams. We have about 30-40 minutes of content here. So as you go along, you can post your questions in the chat, and then of course we'll tackle them after. You know, I'm reminded of strategy at this moment. You know, we're currently seeing some rains where I am. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, on the West Coast. So we're seeing some rains and we're seeing some flooding, and it's interesting to see just how much strategy really plays a role in everything that we do. And while we talk about it from a marketing perspective, the process is very similar, right? So here, the local government is really struggling to deal with the ever-changing climate that we get to see every year, on the heat, on the rain side, but this is every place. So we'll continue to see really the impact of really good strategies as they deal with the different changes in climate, and then poor strategies. And you know, it's always fascinating to see. Now, my background is in data and decisions, and I work with companies, primarily marketing teams, to help them sort their data, organize it, report on it, and then of course find insights, which is what everyone wants from their data. And strategy is a natural outgrowth from it. You'll see me talk a little bit about definition of strategy, but it really is just a set of decisions and how you approach critical decisions. And of course, for marketing teams today, the role of data in everything they do is incredibly important. We are seeing even more teams moving to digital channels at a time when digital channels are becoming harder to track. So marketing is becoming a bit like a quicksand. You know, it's really changing under your feet. So today I organized a presentation into three logical sections. I first want to talk about what is strategy. As I mentioned, strategy is really a process. which you can apply to marketing and sales, and of course, an entire company. So we want to understand the distinctions that tend to trip up teams when they start talking about strategy or marketing strategy, and then how that differs from tactics, for example. Then I want to dive a little bit deeper in the design of a strategy. I want to give you a process that you can take back to your team, that you can run over one day or perhaps 2 mornings if you're doing it virtually, as many teams are. And of course, talk about the implementation of strategy. And the formulation of strategy, which is the second point here, is something that a lot of teams tend to enjoy. Once you see a process, you can run through it. But strategies really rarely fail in the formulation. They really tend to really get stuck in implementation as things change. And then we'll finish up with some key takeaways. Let me double check our chat here as we go along, make sure it's nothing from me. Okay. So let's start with a bit of a poll, just to kind of get a sense of who's in the room. And the poll is really, what is your top data-driven strategy challenge? Now, the options you're going to see are some of the most common that have come across with clients, whether it's having too much data, maybe data limitations, maybe too many ideas, there's too many channels you want to be doing, too many things, lack of resources, or perhaps there really is no data, no strategy at all. So this is really ground zero for a lot of you. So I'm going to give a minute here for you to fill out that poll, and then we can see what results we get. What's that? Okay, so it looks like we get some initial results here. Looks at the pretty even across the board. So it's common to see companies at different stages deal with different issues, but there's of course commonality. Having too much data, not knowing what to do with the data, perhaps not knowing how to fit it into a strategy. So we're going to cover a lot of these points today. So let's talk about what strategy is. So I always like to have a clear definition when I work with companies. It's common for me to walk in with teams, and all of a sudden we're talking about customer acquisition or retention or onboarding, and it becomes very obvious, very clear that everyone is really thinking about it differently. Everyone has a slightly different definition of what it means to talk about customer acquisition costs or a retention rate or even an onboarding flow. So we need really a universal definition for us to really work together in this presentation. So I really like this definition by Alan Weiss, where a strategy is a framework within which all decisions are made consistent with the nature and direction of the business, or in this case, a unit, like a marketing unit. So it becomes a wall, a box that gives you constraints on which you want to make the different decisions that you're going to come across. Should you invest in that channel? Are you going to hire that specific role? Are you going to invest in the specific area of your team? That might be more data, for example, or more technology, more, let's say, marketing automation. So what are the different constraints on which you're making decisions? And if you don't have this, then everything is sort of this random walk in the park. You can go in so many different directions, and everyone's not really clear in which way you're headed. So whenever I start a conversation about a strategy formulation with clients, I always like to start with this very simple 2x2 graphic where we have strategy and tactics. You can also think about it as maybe strategy and operations. But the quadrants then play out where you may have good strategy and good operations. So for example, in the top right, we can have a team or a company that has an effective strategy and effective tactics or effective operations. Then in quadrant 2, we have an effective strategy, but effective operations, and then so on, right? The quadrants play out. And what I always like teams to do is to think about companies they know, whether it's well-known companies, Apple, Tesla, or perhaps smaller companies, in their industry, highly specific to what they do. And then we can start to place them and really start to have a conversation around what it means to be good at both, or what it means to be good at one and not the other. So if we take quadrant 1 and we look at companies that have a good strategy and good operations, this is where we can, of course, place someone like Apple, right? And knowing where a company places, in your opinion, is interesting, but what's really more useful is understanding why. Why would you place them there, right? So, I would place Apple there, for example, because not only are they clearly good at what they do. There's delivering the core service of phones and laptops and watches, but they're clearly thinking about how this world is changing for them. We're seeing iPhone sales drop and not be able to continue at the same pace as before. There's only so many times you can upgrade your iPhone. So Apple is naturally moving into this world of services and into this world of health, right? It took the device, the Apple Watch, and they're building all these health features on it to eventually be able to have all kinds of medical services built on top of that. That's pretty clever, right? So we're seeing a really good strategy, how to think about the future, will still be able to deliver well in the present. You can also see Delta, for example, here. Airlines have been in the news recently. There were, all kinds of cancellations. Southwest, canceled hundreds of flights, and American Airlines the same. And there was all this talks about, this shortage of flight attendants and pilots and people to actually help with the unloading and the loading of the flights. And I think even Southwest even blamed the weather. I think that it was too rainy on one day, but somehow it didn't really affect all the airlines. Delta, United weren't really as affected as the other ones. So either Delta and United have find a way to tame the weather, or they clearly have a different way of how they approach the operations. So we can put companies here in the different quadrants. If you go to quadrant 2, where we have a company with perhaps an ineffective strategy but really effective operations, here you might have someone like Volkswagen, as a car maker. They're moving into electric cars, so they're trying to make the strategy work, but their initial sort of attempts of it have been quite buggy to really release their equivalent to the Tesla, right? And again, you might have different companies here. In quadrant 4, companies that have poor strategy, poor operations. This may be sort of like a classic, let's say Theranos, which is also currently in the news. Very big vision about what they want to do with blood testing, but they really failed to deliver on the core promise, and the strategy itself was also lacking. And then perhaps the most controversial quadrant is of course, the number 3. Companies that may have poor operations but good strategy. I typically place Tesla here, where you see a company that clearly is seeing where they want to go in terms of the future of cars, and being a sort of a leader in the development of the batteries and the electric car itself. But the operations seem to be a bit random, right? You sort of, the stock goes up and down depending on what Elon Musk tweets. The Tesla itself has had some quality issues. So it's almost like the company is doing really well because of strategy and perhaps limited by operations. And the point of this really exercise is to understand in your team, as you think about and you have these conversations, to know the distinctions, because conversations about strategy typically get derailed because you really fall deep into the tactics. So you start by saying, what, we want to hit certain revenue goals. We want to move from this kind of marketing model to this other marketing model, perhaps one that's based more on accounts instead of campaigns. So you start to come up with the strategy, and then naturally people must say, okay, well, what about this channel, right? Should we do TikTok? Should we do Instagram? Should we do this? And now you're in the tactics, and now you can debate the tactics ad nauseum, but you really want to figure out the strategy first, those key blocks that you want to build upon, and then from there you have all these different ways of approaching it, all these different tactics you can go through. But taking the conversation in the logical step makes it much easier to actually complete it in a short fashion. And when I see teams that have taken months to formulate a strategy, what you're seeing is just this endless back and forth between the strategy and the tactics. They agree that this is what they want to do strategically, but they're really caught up in how they do it tactically. So you start with the what you want to do, and then you can eventually debate the how. The other point about strategy to think about is this idea of the ambiguous zone, which has come up in a few books. And really, whenever you talk about this within teams, very rarely do you get disagreements as to where you want to go, the future. This is what we want to do. We would love to be more data-driven. We want to be able to deal with the increase in privacy issues that we're seeing in data collection. We want to tweak how we do our attribution, so it's driven by an algorithm instead of having some manual method. There's usually no disagreement on this kind of things, but then the challenges become we have to go through them. So this ambiguous zone, the process of actually changing this. Do you have to change how you run your campaigns? Do you have to change who you hire? How you think about it? How you measure them? How you measure success? how bonuses or might be tied into your measurements. So this is all in this ambiguous zone. And really a good strategy isn't so much about trying to answer everything in the zone. It's unexpected, right? I had many clients who were in the middle of 3-year strategies when COVID-19 hit. You can't predict that. So the point isn't to try and avoid all the possible issues, though you can think about them quite a bit. The point is really to know that you can lead through them, right? That you're going to have this uncertainty. You're going to have weeks or months where things aren't clicking. They might be frustrating. They might be unclear. But that's just part of the really of a bold strategy. And trying to set expectations for everyone in it can be quite helpful. So the two axes that I want you to think about in the strategy in the next section as we go into that is really this awareness in the environment and consciousness of actions. And this is all based on a framework called the sentient strategy. It's designed to be quite short. Strategy used to be this 5-year endeavor back in post-World War II when you had companies like GE and Ford running strategy. These days, you see it maybe 3 years, and I think that's even becoming even shorter, right? Where strategies over 12 months, 18 months is becoming the ideal length. Anything more than that, you're really trying to predict the future. So as we think about these two axes in the next section, really awareness of the environment is understanding what is going on in your industry, right? So are you aware of the limitations that are coming up in the data collection? Are you aware in how consumer expectations are changing around privacy and how they expect to be tracked or not tracked? Are you aware of trends in how consumers are purchasing, right? We're seeing an ever increasing way of purchasing digitally. Some of the things that we're seeing in COVID are going to stay behind. So as a marketing team, are you thinking about these things? And then consciousness is, are you aware of the things that make your team strong? So you may have a very strong branding approach or a very strong brand. Are you able to leverage that? Do you have you may have a very great way of designing campaigns or thinking about the different approaches. So being conscious of your different actions and the different ways you can approach things. Those are the two axes we'll talk about briefly in the next section. Okay, let me take a quick pause here. I see no questions, so I continue. So the overall plan, and again, strategy doesn't have to be this complex thing that you have to go to school to understand it. There really is relatively straightforward, right? So whenever you run this in your team, and typically, again, we might run this over a day in person or perhaps 2 mornings via Zoom. And the reason why we split over 2 mornings is simply because an entire day of Zoom calls is exhausting. If you've ever done that, it is just really hard. But 2 or 3 hours in the morning, 2 or 3 hours in the second day, that's doable. There's, of course, some prep to think about, but that's the overall way you can start to approach the planning of this. So the overall steps they want to cover over this few hours. First is this idea of a strategy and the axes as well, right? Well, that just covered with you. So everyone understands that deciding to run something on TikTok is a tactic, and trying to increase a certain amount of revenue per customer that may be more strategic. So having a distinction as you go into the conversation helps then to be able to facilitate that conversation. So as people get slightly derailed, as the questions come up, then it can become much easier to bring it around and organize it. We'll talk about the strategic factors. So what are the handful of things you want to focus on? And I'll explain in a second. We, of course, assign accountabilities with your team, who's working on what and by what date. And then we have some basic follow-up. So the structure here is not complex. We're really, I find when I work with teams, they really know within the team what they want to do strategically. If they have a second to think about it, if they have some time to be gathered and talk about where they want to take the marketing team strategically over the next 12 months, maybe 2 years at most, this idea is already floating in the team. They just simply have to get formalized into a way that everyone understands them and you can actually execute on them. So the factors is really choosing the things that you want to improve upon or focus on in your team. So here's a few examples. There's about 8 or 10 examples here. I find with teams, you can also create your own examples. You might actually have the similar ones, but you call them slightly differently. So don't get caught up in the language or in the specifics. The point is you want to organize the different factors that may be relevant to your team, right? So things like values, resources, right? For example, some teams can benefit by just bringing on certain kind of resources in-house, whether it's to say something data specific, like a data analyst, sometimes like a operations role, like a marketing operations role can be very helpful. Resource, of course, might also not include people. It may be something else they want to bring on. You then, of course, have people, behaviors, customers, technology, knowledge, culture. Data itself could become a factor here. They want to specialize. So you start by really organizing, the 5, 10, maybe 15 different factors that you think could be relevant to your team in a language that makes sense within your own team. And from here, we want to really find the 2, 3, maybe at most 4 factors that you want to focus on over the next short period. Typically, when I run this exercise, it's helpful to get people into small groups. So if you have, let's say, 8 people in a session, we might split into groups of 2, so you have 4 groups, and then they all determine the top 3 factors that they think could be relevant for the team, and then you get to share as a group. So right away, you get to start getting a sense as to the different perceptions that people have as to what should be a focus, right? Is data a focus across everyone, or do you have different things? And that through that group conversation, you start to get some agreement on what those actual top 3 should be. Now, naturally, we can also have a bit of a litmus test on how to really determine what are the best factors for your team or for your marketing strategy. And the litmus tests are simply a high, medium, low scoring criteria. So we take the factors and then we gauge them here. And when I say, is this going to help us with speed? We saw, for example, in the pandemic, this ever increasing need to deliver things quickly, right? To be able to switch from what may become quickly an outdated model into something that's much more relevant. I had a client that they were doing in-person fitness classes at the beginning of the pandemic. So naturally, everything was closed. And they switched into digital delivery of the online classes very quickly, in about a month or so, something that they were expected to do over maybe 12 months. So some of the factors may allow you to have more speed. Technology, for example, is a factor that fits nicely into speed. Being able to send campaigns faster without engineering help is a natural way to increase the speed at which you can test and try different ideas. Flexibility as a litmus test, right? Does this make your team more flexible? Does it give you more options? Does it give you the ability to try different things without getting locked into an approach? Disruption and volatility tend to become factors on their own. They're very similar. And what we're seeing is companies that are sort of thinking about their own disruption or thinking about how to disrupt how they approach things tend to do much better since that disruption tends to be coming. We saw in the news, for example, GE broke up after many years. The sort of conglomerate, old school idea from the 20th century. But that idea was really quite obvious for maybe about 5-10 years. And that disruption was forced upon GE instead of being forced within the company, right? Volatility as another factor as well, trying to understand if a factor can help you become much more innovative, much more of a leader in your industry in how you're approaching how you market or how you reach customers. Innovation, of course, as its own litmus factor, and then risk assessment, where you're trying to determine what is the risk of any individual factor approach. Does it help you reduce risk? And I bring technology again. Sometimes technology undertakings can be incredibly risky. Switching from what may seem like a simple solution like a CRM to another CRM can cause chaos, and how you talk to customers and how you manage your data. So trying to always look at what is the different risk assessment that you may get in your team and the different things that can affect how you're approaching things. Especially, when we look at the next couple of years, is clearly going to be a time of high uncertainty, of on enough restrictions, on enough changes in the environment. So how you're thinking about your marketing approach from what you can do one day to maybe what you can do in a month, those are all things that you want to start to think about in this litmus test portion. Once you're able to narrow down, again, through a bit of a group conversation, what may seem like the top 3 factors, there's really only 3 things you can do with any given factor. You can maintain it. You may be quite happy with it. You may be quite happy with your people, with the people you have in your team, the culture you have built. So it may be just be maintaining it, and what's that mean, right? You may try to build it. For example, you may need to build something from scratch. Perhaps your marketing automation is quite weak, and you really need to build it to a capacity that makes sense. Or it may be to do a complete replacement. You try an approach, you have an existing, let's say CRM that's really not working, and it just needs to be completely replaced from it. And then this is where we really start talking about the how, right? This is where we start to understand what, now that we know what we want to do, how do we do it? And this is great because everyone loves the how. Everyone loves to talk about the specifics. But you can see that we spend some time trying to really think at the strategic level before we really get down into the weeds as to, we really want to replace the CRM. Here's the top 3 choices. Here's the rough plan on how to do this, and so on, right? So we have some appropriate actions here to figure out. This is also where we start to figure out the assignments. You may assign different people, different factors, or different teams, or different groups of people to own it and try to understand how do you take this now into an actual execution. There's also a bullet point here at the bottom, this idea of a critical issues list. Naturally, things will come up in the conversation that are critical. You cannot ignore, but never really appropriate to discuss at that moment. For example, you may be talking about data as a strategic factor, and someone says, very obviously, what about iOS 14.5 and the increasing limitations we're seeing in how we can collect data? This is a clear issue, but it's also very specific on the how. It's very, very, very tactical. So we can take this critical issues list and simply add it there, right? This is just a running list of things we want to get to before we finish this strategy formulation session. So we know we have to talk about iOS 14.5, but not at this moment. So this is very helpful to ensure they can keep the focus on the right steps without ignoring or completely disregarding what are critical issues. So at the end, we want to make sure we go through all the issues and say, here's what we, how we can start thinking about this specific issue, iOS 14.5, and so on. So this is the rough process here to start to formulate what this might look like. Let's talk a little bit about data here for a few minutes. Whenever I look at marketing teams in particular, I need to understand where they are in a bit of a data maturity scale, right? So I built this a couple of years ago across 3 time zones. I only know 3, with the past, the present, and the future. And this helps me and helps a marketing team understand where they're really strong at and where are the opportunities, right? So when we look at the past, we're really trying to understand what happened, right? So what happened last quarter for a specific campaign, what happened last month for this email sequence that we sent. This is really the realm of data analysis, where we're taking the past data, it's already done, and we're just simply trying to extract something from it, whether it's an average, an average open rate, an average spend, an average cost of acquisition, and so on. In the present, we're trying to understand what is going on. So we may have active campaigns that are currently running. We may have sequences, automation sequences that are currently in process, and we want to understand how they are performing, right? Are they matching any projections we had initially set? Do they look like they're promising? A/B tests, for example, naturally fall into this world. You run the A/B test, and you're trying to see how the A/B test is performing along the way. And this is really data reporting. If you have any kind of BI tools, like business intelligence tools, they really fall under this area where you're trying to report on things that are really happening in the moment. And then lastly, we have the future. And in the future, we're starting to predict what might happen. In marketing, a classic example is something like an attribution model that is supported or powered by an algorithm, by machine learning. So it starts to predict how a channel might perform, how a user might convert. I've been seeing more and more teams build effectively prediction models on conversions. So they have users and there's a likelihood of their conversion. And again, conversion here might mean a sign up or a purchase or something else. And this is really the realm of data science. Now, to understand the future, you naturally need to be able to understand the past and the present, to understand what happened in the past, what's going on right now, and what may happen. So as a team, you can look at these three areas and start thinking, okay, we may do really well in the past. If we have the data, we can completely take it, analyze it, crunch it, and then give something out. You may say, our present is really good. We have really good visibility as to what is going on in all our campaigns relatively quickly, and maybe our future isn't as strong. So based on this, you can start to figure out what areas in your team do you need different approaches, right? A data analyst, for example, fits nice into the past. In the present, it's really a combination of like a data analyst with some dashboarding. And of course, the future is a data scientist. So you may start to think about different people that could be helpful to bring into your team, different technology, right? The past, it's really just data analysis. It could be done as simple as Excel, as complex as like Python. Present is again, BI tools, and future is being able to build these things out into your existing stack of technology. And there's all these other things you can start to think about. iOS 14.5 tends to play out very well in the present, right? Issues around privacy can play out across all of them. So you start to get a sense as to what gaps exist in your data and what opportunities also exist for you to leverage that across these three time zones. Okay. Let me again pause for questions here. I see none. We're about 30 minutes in, 25 minutes in. So let's look at the final section here about the implementation. So by this point, there's a consensus as to the approach of what you want to do from a marketing perspective. Perhaps the strategic goals on your marketing team, maybe the key people you need to bring on, the key resources, key technology changes. There might be, of course, some specific how, some tactics, new channels to approach, new ways to think about it. And what's interesting about the strategic focus is it gives you a chance to really tackle ideas that they really may be no time in a day-to-day basis. I meet many teams who are in this incredibly reactive mode, and they're just pulling out fires left and right, and they're really good at it. They're really good at just moving the ball along in a day-to-day fashion. But because they never take the time to think about the future strategically, they're really missing out on big, bold moves, right? We saw, for example, about a month ago where the Staples Arena, the basketball arena in LA is getting renamed to the Crypto.com Arena. Now, putting aside the practicalities of the name, it's a massive deal, something like $750 million over 10 years. So clearly Crypto.com, the company, is seeing value here to pay out this much. And it's a branding play. And I see different people justify it with actual numbers, but it's also just straight up branding. So as a company, what kind of sort of big, bold moves are you not seeing because you're simply focused on the day-to-day of what a campaign looks like, what the performance is of that, and then maybe some major moves to be thinking about. And that's really the goal of simply taking some time, even if it's just an afternoon, to run through some of these points. Okay, let me finish the last section and then tackle a couple questions. So implementation, as I mentioned, once you really find the time to do this, everyone really enjoys this conversation and thinking about this. So let's look at some of the common failure points. This is where really strategies really fall apart, or at least not really fulfill their entire purpose. So it's really 4 common failure points that I tend to see. The first is no resolve. So you really may have gone through the process, maybe it was a little too top down. That is, this is the strategic points that were given to a marketing team, but there's really no buy-in, right? No commitment to it, or maybe no connections to how this major strategic points actually play out on a day-to-day fashion. So there's really no result. There's really no motivation to go through what can be major cultural changes in teams and how they approach things. And no resolve really comes down to really finding the motivation, right? Finding that connection between what you may see as a very abstract goal. We want to improve the brand of the company, to how that actually plays out on the day-to-day fashion. The second is no accountabilities. So you may came up with the right strategic goals. It was fleshed out, but it really wasn't assigned to anyone. So no one really knows who should be working on it, what's their role, who needs to drive the ball forward and make sure it keeps moving. So accountability it's relatively straightforward. Being able to assign the different pieces to the right people, make sure they have the right support, and be able to check in on them. Number 3 is no infrastructure. This is common when companies want to become quite data-driven, for example, but they really don't have the infrastructure to support it. That is, they don't really have the proper way to collect data. They don't really have the proper way to visualize it. They don't have the right data-specific roles, like a data analyst or data engineer. So they're really missing key infrastructure to make this data-driven change work. And without it, it becomes really, really hard. Then you really are expecting people to do a lot on their own. You're expecting people to somehow collect their own data and visualize it and analyze it and so on. And it's just a little bit too much. And that's just the data side, right? You may have a lack of infrastructure on the technology side. You may want to do all this kind of advanced marketing automation, but your current technology might not support it. You may want to do certain things within your team, but you don't have enough communication with the sales team. I work with a marketing team that sort of operated in a bit of an island from a sales team, and the sales team was not really getting the type of leads that they were expecting, and there was just very poor communication. So in that case, it was almost like a poor infrastructure of communication between two teams. So you really need to identify what this poor infrastructure might be in your team, what may cause issues, and try to tackle them. And then lastly, monitoring. So a strategy like this is quite short, 12 months, 18 months. There should really be some kind of check-in, either on a monthly basis or perhaps on a quarterly basis, with the different accountabilities, right? The different people that own different items, and see what is the progress on them. Is it as expected, or are you running into key issues that need to be resolved? And again, I have seen many strategies that were formulated at great expense, perhaps over a weekend, and that was never really checked upon. Things came up, the day-to-day came up, and that strategy sort of fell by the wayside. So having just a basic monitoring to ensure that you're making adequate progress on the things that were set. And some questions to ask here as you figure out some of this failure points in implementation, right? Who's going to be responsible for what item and by when? So not only specific assignments and accountabilities, but really specific deadlines. Again, if you're going through a technology change or upgrade, what are the different logical steps here, right? The finding the top vendors, talking to them, getting pricing, looking at the implementation feasibility, and so on. So having rough deadlines for when things will happen. They are realistic. This is not a try to do everything by tomorrow type of approach, but be able to have clear accountabilities. How often are you going to check in for progress? Again, this might be monthly, quarterly. You might have some initial check-ins much frequent at the beginning, or perhaps later on, as the periods will ramp up. But just having clear monitoring that people know that this is when we're checking in. What are the common obstacles or roadblocks they may encounter? You may, for example, I've been with many marketing teams that they know exactly what they want, let's say from the data, but they get completely shut down by legal or compliance. So if this is your company, if you work, for example, in finance, crypto, of course, has a lot of this, and really a lot of major enterprises have major significant legal and compliance requirements. this is just something you can expect. So what's the way to proactively deal with it as you approach a specific item? How do you make sure you get buy-in from all the stakeholders? Ideally, when you're formulated, you're really good at buy-in in a group setting, but you may also have people outside. There needs to be buy-in. So classic approach here to ensure that you're not getting blocked. And then, how you make the rewards tangible and practical. At the end of the day, you really want to make sure the strategy makes sense with what people are thinking or wanting to do at a tactical level, and making sure there is a connection between major changes, especially when they're supposed to be major cultural changes, which are perhaps some of the most difficult to implement. Okay, before I do this, let me look at the question. I see a few. Okay, so let me see what I have here. So I have a Q&A in chat. So let me start here with the Q&A. Let me read it out. What if you have bad data or data you're unsure is 100% accurate? How would you recommend to go about formulating a strategy or sifting through data to find real results they can create a strategy from? Yes. So lack of trust in data is very common. I would actually recommend that you tackle the lack of trust before you actually go through the strategy. Otherwise, you might be formulating a strategy based on numbers that are just completely off, right? Your averages on cost of acquisition or lifetime value or retention may be really different from what they're actually are in reality. So lack of trust is the issue here. And the lack of trust that needs to be broken down into the possible root causes. So as a broad issue, lack of trust can be very difficult to deal with. But in my experience, there's really about 3 reasons why lack of trust happens in the first place. So in your team, you have to think about what is the most likely cause for your team. So for example, one reason why you get a lack of trust in the data or bad data is maybe technical. That is just technically being collected incorrect. There's a bug in how the data is collected. It's over collected, it's under collected, whatever that is. So technical issues, of course, have to be resolved with technical solutions. So you work with your engineers to figure out the issues there. The second reason is actually misaligned expectations. So that is sometimes you have teams that were working off an expectation that their cost of acquisition was $50, and this has always been the assumed expectation. But then when you get actual data, you see that your number is 75. So that creates a lack of trust, because you're like, we thought it was 50. You tell us it's 75. Who's right? So in that case, you actually need to work with, let's say, a data analyst to really look at the formulas and double check the numbers, so you can come back and say, what, we triple check everything. This number is correct. Previously, this expectation was incorrect or was perhaps in the past. And then the third reason that's surprisingly common is simply you're dealing with different formulas. The most common examples here is when you're trying to compare numbers between, let's say, your an ad platform like Facebook, Google, and then you're trying to compare numbers with your own systems. And Facebook is showing you had 1,000 conversions at $50 per conversion, but your system is showing that you had 700 conversions at double the price, whatever it may be. So in those cases, same thing. It's not so much that it was improperly collected, it's that you have different ways of calculating the data. So the formulas are actually different. You may have different time zones. Either way, in this third scenario, you also want to work with a data analyst or just someone who actually understands both data sources to understand the discrepancies and be able to explain them. That's really the issue. So in summary, it sounds like in your case, it's really a lack of trust that you want to work with. You want to go through one of those probably 3 scenarios and deal with that first before you formulate a strategy based on that data. Let me know if that answers your question. Otherwise, you can post another one, I believe. Okay, so let me see. Let me go back to the chat. If I can find it right here. Okay. Let me see. Cool. How should companies balance how they approach attribution and paid spend with an ever-increasing amount of data? Obviously, revenue, sales, and link. Okay, yeah, these two questions. Okay. So yes, so first question about balancing attribution and paid spending. This is really tricky. It's important to understand just how quickly this world is changing on attribution, especially if you're on the mobile side, and how opaque data is getting. What I think really work best with teams is a few things. First, you really need to recalibrate expectations. I've been working with companies recently that they were really expecting 100% accuracy on their attribution, and that's just really really a way to really fail at this, because you're never going to get that, and it's going to be very frustrating. So you really need to reset expectations that when you're dealing with attribution data, paid spending data, you're really dealing with not 100% accuracy. It might be 90%, 85%. You're really dealing with directional data. That is, it's data that you can use to tell you the direction of where you want to go, but you're not really dealing with true source of truth data. Some really large companies are perhaps getting around this, but this is affecting everybody. The second thing is, of course, shifting your spending, because at the end of the day, your goal here is to take your spending and put it in wherever you think the best place is to achieve your goals. So I've been seeing a lot more companies shift their spending to their own channels. So really invest in email, for example. Really invest in ways they can communicate with customers directly without the third parties. This is, of course, not viable for everybody. I'm not here to say that you should stop running Facebook ads and running Google ads, but you should be thinking about how to take your spending and put it in different places. That's not just paid spending. And the third is you do want to leverage the technology that can make this easier. So for a lot of companies, before a couple of years ago, they really didn't have, attribution software, like custom attribution software. It was costly and it seemed a little over the top. And now it's becoming much more important. So there is technology that is coming out that is a bit of a combination of machine learning, combination of just better data collection to help sort or provide better attribution data. And this is becoming much more important as some of this data is much harder to collect. Okay, let me see. There's a second question here. Okay, obviously revenue sales is a leading indicator, but how do you know if a strategy is effective or ineffective upon starting a new strategy, knowing it takes time to see results? Yes. So in that section where we talk about designing a strategy, there were the appropriate actions. You of course may have this long-term goals of revenue sales, but in some cases, as the question mentions, it might take 3, 6, 12 months before you see them. And if it takes 12 months and you're working on an 18-month strategy, it's a bit difficult. This is like economics data. Economists have gotten a bad rap because they've been really quite bad at trying to predict what happens in the economy. But on one hand, it's actually not their fault. The numbers they deal with, unemployment, productivity, they take years to play out. So by the time they see a trend, it's already a year in the making. So naturally, companies, you can access metrics that are also available much sooner. So what I would recommend is you really want to have short-term and long-term metrics. Your ultimate long-term metric might be revenue or sales, but you really want to have those short-term metrics that show progress towards those. So in those cases, in those cases, you might be looking at, for example, higher engagement, perhaps on your ads at the top of the funnel. You might be looking at the engagement as users are engaging with your product itself, in the first few days or few weeks. And you're starting to look for these different behaviors or metrics that tell you, what, it looks like users are more higher engaged. They enjoy the product more. They're saying it perhaps in qualitative fashion, right? Like surveys or NPS. So we're seeing increases in all the short-term metrics. So we feel confident, or at least more confident, that we're going to be able to hit some of those long-term metrics. So you really need those, right? You really need to know if you're working on a 12-month strategy, if you're really on track by month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, and short-term metrics will help you there. Okay, let me see. I think that's all we have open. Yeah, that's all I see on my end. Looks like we got about 10 minutes here to go. Let me just do key takeaways and then pass it on to Megan. If you have any other final questions, post them up. Happy to answer them. So what we discussed today, we really talk about strategy as a process, and then we went a little bit more specific into content or marketing. But we also define what strategy is, the differences between strategy and tactics. It's a really helpful way to really organize and have a productive group conversation on this. We talked briefly about the sentient axis and the role they play in the awareness of your environment and the consciousness of your actions. The factors, the ability to determine the 10 to 15 factors for your company, and then of course how to prioritize them using the litmus test, and then the appropriate actions for each one. And then lastly, we talked briefly about the failure points. So the common things, again, the way of a strategy that has been formulated for success. That is all I have. So let me pass it on here to Megan.
Thank you so much, Ruben. If you want to go back one slide so everyone has your contact information, and we'll be able to share that after the presentation. We will be providing a recording. So if you want to get in touch with Ruben, please do. I want to thank Ruben so much for his time. I did just see one other question come in. Ruben, do you have any other suggested follow-up reading materials on this topic that you could share with us?
Yeah. There's a few books. So classically, strategy was effectively invented by Peter Drucker. So there is a few books that Peter Drucker wrote. I will say The Effective Executive and The Practice of Management are two books that come to mind, and you can look for a few others. HBR, the Harvard Business Review, has done quite a few also case studies on strategy. But I will also challenge people to think about the companies that you do know. We're all consumers. We all have opinions on products that we think do well. And we have all interacted with companies, right? Not just our company. So I would actually really take a second to think about the companies that you think are doing well or you have always enjoyed doing business with. And what are the things you might be seeing different between them and others, right? Between, let's say, Apple and Microsoft, or when you fly, Delta versus United, and really start to look at what seems to be the strategy that they're pursuing, maybe the strategy they're talking about publicly versus the things you're seeing in a day-to-day fashion. And I think that's a helpful exercise to understand the distinctions between companies that do well and companies that may be struggling.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ruben. And I don't see any other questions, so we could probably just end the webinar here. Thank you again for joining us today. It was great to hear your insights. For those of you who joined, thank you. We will be sending out a recording. You're also welcome to go to our growth community. Just go to MoEngage.com. You'll be able to navigate to the growth community pretty easily to see other content that's of support and resources. As always, do feel free to get in touch with Ruben or myself if you have any questions. And thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.